"Take that hat off," Ryan Cole said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the hangar. "You didn't earn it." The words landed hard in the open space, echoing faintly off steel beams and polished concrete, drawing the attention of every sailor and operator within earshot as conversations died mid-sentence and boots shifted subtly against the floor. The morning light filtered through the high windows in long, pale strips, catching the dust in the air and outlining the contrast between them with almost cinematic precision. Ryan Cole, a Navy SEAL in full operational gear, posture rigid with confidence, every line of his uniform crisp and intentional, standing like a symbol of modern military precision, and across from him, an old man who looked entirely out of place, wearing a faded jacket and a weathered cap pulled low over thinning gray hair, his stance relaxed, almost indifferent, as if the tension surrounding him belonged to another world entirely. Arthur Hayes didn't respond. He didn't flinch. His hands remained still at his sides, one thumb hooked loosely into the seam of his jacket pocket, the other resting near the brim of that hat, the hat that had just become the center of attention. It was old, undeniably so. The fabric had softened with time, the edges worn down into a quiet curve, and a faint, nearly erased insignia sat on the front, its details lost to decades of sun and salt and memory. To anyone else, it looked like something picked up at a roadside stand or forgotten in the back of a closet. To Ryan, it was an insult, a piece of unearned identity worn in a place where everything was supposed to be earned. A few of the younger operators nearby exchanged glances, subtle smirks forming, their shoulders relaxing as the situation began to tilt toward entertainment. One of them muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to earn a quiet chuckle, and the sound rippled outward, restrained but unmistakable. Authority, after all, had a gravity of its own, and Ryan carried it like he'd been born into it. He took a step closer, boots striking the concrete with deliberate weight, closing the distance as if proximity alone would force compliance. "You hear me," he added, tilting his head slightly, studying the old man like a problem already solved. "This isn't a museum. You don't get to. We're history you didn't live." The words were clean, practiced, sharpened by repetition and belief. Around them, the hangar seemed to tighten, the air growing denser, heavier, as if even the building itself was waiting to see how this would end. Arthur's gaze lifted then, slow and measured, meeting Ryan's eyes with a calm that didn't challenge, didn't submit, just existed, steady and immovable. There was something in that look, something old and quiet and impossibly grounded, like a mountain that had seen storms come and go without ever needing to react. But Ryan didn't see that. Not yet. He saw hesitation where there was patience, silence where there was restraint. And in that miscalculation, his confidence deepened. "Go ahead," Ryan said, gesturing casually toward the hat, his tone dropping into something almost conversational, almost generous. "Take it off. No one's going to make a big deal out of it." The offer hung in the air, thin and insincere. Somewhere behind them, a clipboard snapped shut. A radio crackled softly, and then went quiet. The small details of the world kept moving, but slower now, muted, like everything had stepped back to give this moment room to unfold. Arthur's fingers shifted slightly, brushing the edge of the hat, not removing it, not adjusting it, just acknowledging it, as if the gesture itself carried more weight than any explanation ever could. His voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, and almost lost beneath the vastness of the space. Yet somehow every person present heard it clearly. It's already where it belongs. No defiance. No edge. Just a statement. Ryan blinked once, the simplicity of the response catching him off guard for the briefest of moments before irritation filled the gap. He exhaled through his nose, a faint smile pulling at one corner of his mouth, not amused, just certain. "Yeah," he said, reaching out now, fingers brushing the worn fabric with a dismissive tap. "We'll see about that." And the second his hand made contact with the hat, something unseen shifted in the air, not dramatic, not visible, but real enough that a few of the men nearby straightened without knowing why, a subtle unease threading through the room like a signal just beyond comprehension, as if the moment had quietly crossed a line no one there yet understood. Ryan Cole did not pull his hand away immediately, and that was the first mistake he made without realizing it, because the moment his fingers rested against the worn fabric, he expected resistance, or at least a reaction, something that would justify the authority he believed he held in that space. But Arthur Hayes did not move, did not stiffen, did not even shift his weight, and that absence of reaction created a strange imbalance that no one could quite explain as the faint hum of the hangar lights seemed suddenly louder, sharper, cutting through the silence that had settled over the gathered operators like a low ceiling pressing down on them all. Ryan tapped the brim again, a little harder this time, a subtle escalation disguised as casual dismissal, but the gesture felt different now, heavier, as if the object itself carried a weight that had nothing to do with fabric or stitching, and somewhere behind him one of the younger sailors cleared his throat, the sound quick and uncertain, like he had just realized he had stepped into something deeper than a simple joke. Arthur's eyes did not leave Ryan's face, calm and unblinking, but there was a shift there now, not in emotion, but in depth, as if the silence between them had opened into something older, something that did not belong to the present moment. And for a fraction of a second Ryan hesitated, not enough for anyone to call it doubt, but enough that his next breath came just slightly slower than the last. "You think that means something," Ryan said, his tone tightening just enough to betray the edge creeping in beneath his confidence. "But around here, meaning comes with records, with files, with proof." And he gestured vaguely toward the command offices beyond the hangar doors, towards systems and screens and databases that defined identity in the modern Navy, systems that left no room for stories that could not be verified. Arthur listened, the same way he had listened to everything so far, without interruption, without urgency, as if time itself moved differently for him. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet weight, steady and unforced. "Not everything that matters is written down." The sentence was simple, almost easy to dismiss, but it landed in the space between them with a density that made it linger, and for a brief moment no one spoke, no one moved, as if the entire hangar had paused to consider something it could not quite name. Ryan exhaled through his nose again, sharper this time, and stepped closer, closing the gap completely now, the authority in his posture hardening as he reached up once more, this time not to tap, but to remove, his fingers curling around the edge of the hat with a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. "Then let me make this simple for you," he said, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, but the tension carried it further anyway, stretching it across the room like a wire pulled tight. "You do not wear things you did not earn. Not here." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed inevitable, the outcome already decided, the old man about to be corrected, the line about to be enforced. But then something subtle shifted again, not in Arthur, not in Ryan, but in the room itself, as Lieutenant Mark Ellis, standing off to the side near a maintenance console, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the hat, not with curiosity, but with recognition that had not yet fully formed, like a memory just out of reach. There was something about the insignia, something almost erased, but not entirely, a pattern that did not match any current unit, any modern designation, and yet it felt familiar in a way that unsettled him. The kind of familiarity that came from long hours studying history, from archived footage and declassified briefings that most people never saw. Ellis glanced from the hat to Arthur's face, then back again, and a quiet unease began to settle in his chest, slow and deliberate, as if a puzzle had just presented itself without warning. Around him, the others remained focused on Ryan, on the confrontation that had drawn them in, but Ellis was already stepping back, already reaching for the small device clipped to his belt, his movements subtle, almost invisible beneath the weight of the moment, because something about this did not feel right, not in a way he could explain, but in a way he could not ignore. And as Ryan's grip tightened on the edge of the hat, preparing to pull it free, Ellis turned slightly away, his voice low. As he spoke into the line, careful, controlled, but carrying a quiet urgency that had not been there a minute ago. "Command, this is Lieutenant Ellis," he said, eyes still locked on the old man, on the hat, on the silence that had somehow grown louder than any argument. "I need a quick verification on a possible legacy insignia, something off record, and I need it now." And as the words left his mouth, the tension in the hangar did not break. It deepened, stretching tighter, sharper, as if the moment was no longer just about a hat or a challenge, but about something far larger beginning to surface, something that had been waiting, quietly, for a very long time. The response did not come back immediately, and that silence was the second shift that no one in the hangar could ignore, because in a place where information usually moved at the speed of command and confirmation, even a few seconds felt like something stretching beyond its normal limits, and Lieutenant Ellis felt it first, the faint delay pressing against his ear as he kept his voice low and steady, repeating the request with careful clarity while his eyes never left the old man or the hand gripping the hat. "Stand by," the voice on the other end finally replied, but it carried a tone that was no longer routine, no longer casual, and that alone was enough to tighten something in Ellis's chest as he straightened slightly, his posture shifting from observation to attention without fully realizing it. Across the hangar, Ryan Cole had already committed to the moment, his fingers firm against the worn fabric as he began to pull, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with the kind of controlled authority that expected compliance, expected the world to move the way he directed it to move. But the hat did not come free, not because Arthur resisted, not because there was a struggle, but because the motion itself seemed to stall in a way that made Ryan pause, just briefly, as if something invisible had interrupted the natural flow of action. Arthur Hayes did not tighten his grip, did not step back, did not raise his voice, and yet the space between them had changed, becoming heavier, denser, as if the simple act of removing that hat carried consequences that had not yet been revealed. "Let go," Ryan said, quieter now, not louder, not more aggressive, but more focused, the edge of certainty beginning to sharpen into something else, something closer to insistence. And still Arthur did not react, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if the moment unfolding in front of him was something he had already seen before, something that did not require urgency or defense. Near the console, Ellis turned slightly away, listening as the line came back to life again. But this time there was movement behind the voice, muted voices in the background, a chair scraping, a tone of sudden attention that had not been there moments earlier. "Lieutenant, confirm the insignia description," the voice said, more direct now, and Ellis swallowed once, eyes narrowing as he focused harder on the nearly erased symbol, tracing its shape in his mind, pulling from memory, from briefings, from fragments of history that did not often surface in active service. It is a circular mark, partially worn," he said carefully, "faint anchor outline, no modern designation, looks pre-standard registry, possibly unofficial or legacy classified." There was a pause, shorter this time, followed by a different voice stepping in, older, sharper, carrying a weight of authority that cut clean through the static. "Repeat that," the new voice said, and Ellis did, slower now, more deliberate, each word placed with precision, and when he finished, the silence on the line did not feel empty. It felt charged, like something had just been recognized on the other side that could not be ignored. Back on the hangar floor, Ryan finally released the tension in his hand, not fully letting go of the hat, but loosening his grip just enough to reassess, his jaw tightening slightly as he studied Arthur again, this time with a fraction less certainty than before, as if something beneath the surface had begun to shift in a way he could not quite define. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," Ryan said. But the words did not carry the same ease they had before, and a few of the operators nearby had stopped smiling entirely now, their attention sharpened, their instincts quietly adjusting to something they could not yet explain. Arthur's voice came again, just as calm, just as steady. "No," he said, "it already is." And somewhere far beyond the hangar, in a command office where conversations were rarely interrupted, a chair pushed back with sudden force as the voice on Ellis's line spoke. Again, this time not to him, but to someone else in the room, the words sharp, urgent, and unmistakable. "Get the Admiral. Now." The words did not echo this time. They sank, heavy and immediate, as if the entire structure of the base had absorbed the command and was now holding its breath. And in the hangar the change was subtle but undeniable, a shift in atmosphere that moved faster than sound, faster than understanding, reaching the instincts of the men before their minds could catch up, because something in the way the moment unfolded no longer felt routine, no longer felt contained. Lieutenant Ellis lowered his voice further, instinctively straightening as the line remained open, and he could hear movement now, not distant, not muffled, but urgent, controlled, the kind of movement that only happened when someone of real authority had just been brought into a situation that did not tolerate delay. Lieutenant, the voice returned, sharper, more focused, do not escalate. Maintain position. Repeat, maintain position. Ellis swallowed once, eyes flicking briefly toward Ryan, toward Arthur, then back to the insignia on the hat, as if confirming again that what he had seen was real. Yes, sir, he replied quietly, but his posture had already changed, shoulders squared, feet set, as though he had unconsciously stepped into a different role entirely. Across the hangar, Ryan Cole noticed the shift without knowing why, the subtle tightening in the room, the way conversations had completely stopped now, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to awareness, and it irritated him. That loss of control over the tone of the moment, that quiet drift away from the clear line of authority he had established just minutes before. He released the hat fully this time, not in surrender, but in recalculation, his hand dropping back to his side as his eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing the man in front of him with a sharper, more deliberate focus. You have got people making calls now, Ryan said, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something new, something that had not been there before, all over a piece of fabric. He let the words hang, expecting a reaction, expecting even a hint of defensiveness, but Arthur Hayes remained exactly as he had been, unmoved, unhurried, his presence steady in a way that did not match the rising tension around him. It is not the fabric, Arthur said quietly, his gaze drifting for the briefest moment toward the far end of the hangar, as if he were listening for something beyond the immediate, something not yet visible. It never was. The sentence settled into the air with a quiet finality that made it difficult to challenge, not because it was loud, but because it carried a certainty that did not invite argument. Ryan exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, grounding himself in the familiar weight of his training, his rank, the structure that had always defined his place in moments like this. Then what is it? He asked, not mocking now, not openly, but still pushing, still trying to pull the situation back into something he could control. Arthur did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched, not awkward, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if the answer itself did not need to be rushed, as if time was no longer a factor worth considering. Around them, a few of the operators shifted their stance, the earlier smirks gone entirely now, replaced with a quiet attention that bordered on respect, though none of them would have said it out loud. Not yet. Not without confirmation, but they felt it, something in the old man's stillness, something that did not match the assumptions they had made just minutes ago. Near the entrance of the hangar, a petty officer stepped into view, pausing just inside the threshold as if unsure whether to proceed, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Ellis, then on Ryan, then finally on Arthur, and something in his expression tightened, subtle but unmistakable, as though he had just been told something he was still trying to process. He did not speak, did not interrupt, but remained there, waiting, watching, as if anticipating the arrival of something that would change everything. Ellis caught sight of him and gave the smallest nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever was happening was no longer contained within their immediate chain of command. The air felt different now, heavier, charged with a quiet anticipation that pressed against the senses, and even Ryan could feel it, though he did not fully understand it, a faint shift beneath his confidence, not enough to break it, but enough to make him aware that the ground beneath the moment was no longer as solid as it had seemed. Arthur's hand lifted slightly. Then, not to remove the hat, not to defend it, but simply to rest against it once more, fingers brushing the worn edge with a familiarity that spoke of time measured not in days or years, but in moments that had never been written down, never been recorded, yet had shaped everything that came after. And somewhere beyond the walls of the hangar, footsteps had already begun to move faster, doors opening that were not often opened in urgency, a chain of command shifting into motion not because of protocol, but because of recognition, and though no one inside the hangar had seen it yet, the moment they were standing in was no longer theirs to control. The first sound that broke the tension was not a voice, but the distant rhythm of footsteps moving with purpose, not hurried, not chaotic, but controlled in a way that carried authority long before the source could be seen. And it moved through the corridors beyond the hangar like a signal traveling ahead of its origin, subtle at first, then unmistakable, drawing the attention of those closest to the entrance as heads turned one by one, not out of curiosity now, but instinct. The petty officer near the doorway straightened immediately, his posture snapping into something sharper, more formal, and that alone was enough to ripple through the room, because posture like that did not come from uncertainty, it came from recognition. Ryan Cole noticed it next, the shift in stance, the way the man's shoulders squared, the way his hands came to rest at his sides with deliberate precision, and something in Ryan's chest tightened, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that made a seasoned operator pause before moving forward. "What is this?" Ryan muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, but the words did not carry the same control they had before. Arthur Hayes did not turn toward the sound, did not acknowledge the approaching presence, as if he already knew it was coming, as if he had been waiting not for confirmation, not for validation, but simply for the moment to arrive on its own terms. His hand remained lightly against the brim of the hat, fingers resting with a familiarity that spoke of years no one in that room could see, and his gaze stayed forward, calm, grounded, untouched by the rising tension that now filled every corner of the hangar. Lieutenant Ellis felt it fully now, the weight of what he had set in motion settling over him as he took a half step back, clearing space without thinking, his instincts aligning with something larger than protocol, something that did not need to be explained. The line on his device had gone silent, but not in neglect, in transition, and he knew without being told that whatever response had been triggered was no longer coming through him. The footsteps grew closer, steady, measured, each one echoing just enough to mark time, and the entire hangar seemed to align with that rhythm, as if everything inside it had been recalibrated to a new center of gravity. Conversations had fully ceased now. Tools lay untouched. Even the low mechanical hum seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of approach and the quiet anticipation that followed it. Ryan shifted his stance, subtle but noticeable, his shoulders tightening as he glanced briefly toward the entrance, then back to Arthur, as if trying to reassert control over a situation that was no longer responding to him in the same way. "This is not necessary," he said, louder now, projecting authority back into the space, trying to anchor the moment before it drifted further, but the words landed differently, thinner, less certain, as if the room itself no longer accepted them as the final say. Arthur finally moved, but only slightly, his hand leaving the brim of the hat and falling back to his side, not in surrender, not in preparation, but simply in acknowledgement that the moment had progressed beyond the need for gestures. His expression did not change, but there was something in his stillness now that carried a quiet finality, like a chapter already written waiting to be read aloud. At the edge of the hangar, the first figure came into view, a senior officer moving with calm precision, followed by another, and then another, each step measured, each presence reinforcing the weight of what was unfolding, and the effect was immediate, visible, as those nearest the entrance straightened fully, their posture shifting into formal attention without command, without hesitation. Ryan saw it then, clearly, the chain reaction he could not stop, the silent alignment of discipline and recognition that no longer centered on him. And for the first time since the moment began, he did not speak. He watched. Arthur did not turn. He did not need to. The space between them, once defined by challenge and assumption, had transformed into something else entirely, something quieter, deeper, and far more decisive. The footsteps slowed as they reached the threshold, and the air seemed to hold itself in place, suspended, waiting, as the presence that had been moving toward them finally arrived, and though no words had been spoken yet, the outcome of the moment had already begun to take shape in the silence. The man who stepped through the threshold did not raise his voice, did not signal his presence with anything dramatic, and yet the effect was immediate, absolute, as if the very air in the hangar recognized him before the people did, because Admiral Jonathan Reeves did not need an introduction, not here, not among men who understood rank not as a title, but as a force that shaped everything beneath it. He moved forward with measured steps, each one unhurried, deliberate, his uniform immaculate. The weight of his position carried not in posture alone, but in the quiet authority that surrounded him. And behind him the senior officers who had followed fell into a natural formation, not arranged, not commanded, but aligned by instinct. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence deepened into something almost tangible as the Admiral's gaze swept the room once, not searching, not questioning, but confirming, until it settled on the one figure who had not shifted at all since the moment began. Arthur Hayes stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, as if time had chosen him as its fixed point while everything else adjusted around him. And for the briefest moment, something flickered across the Admiral's face, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, immediate and undeniable. Ryan Cole saw it. Even if he did not understand it, the subtle change in the Admiral's expression, the fraction of a second where the controlled, composed exterior gave way to something deeper, something personal, and that was when the first real crack appeared in Ryan's certainty. "Sir," Ryan began, stepping forward slightly, his voice firm but measured, attempting to re-establish the structure he knew. "This individual that is enough," Admiral Reeves said, his voice calm, even, but carrying a finality that stopped the words mid-breath, not raised, not sharp, but absolute in a way that left no room for continuation. Ryan froze, not by command, but by instinct, the interruption landing with more weight than any reprimand could have carried, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, no longer uncertain, but resolved. The Admiral did not look at Ryan again. His attention had already shifted, fully, completely, to Arthur, and as he took the last few steps forward, the distance between them closed in a way that felt less like movement and more like a return to something that had never truly been gone. Arthur met his gaze, calm as ever, but there was something different now, something almost imperceptible, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken aloud. The two men stood facing each other, separated by nothing but a few feet of open space and decades of history that no one else in the room could see. For a moment, no one breathed. No one shifted. Even the faint sounds of the base beyond the hangar seemed to fall away, leaving only the presence of the two figures at the center of it all. Then, without a word, Admiral Reeves straightened fully, his posture sharpening into formal precision, and in a movement so clean, so deliberate that it seemed to slice through the silence itself, he raised his hand in a salute. It was not casual. It was not symbolic. It was exact, disciplined, and filled with a level of respect that needed no explanation, and the effect was immediate, overwhelming, as every man in the hangar felt it at once, the sudden, undeniable shift in the balance of everything they thought they understood. Ryan Cole stood motionless, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing, the image of a four-star admiral saluting an old man in a worn jacket and a faded hat breaking through every assumption he had made just moments ago. Around him, the others followed without command, without hesitation, their bodies responding before their thoughts could catch up, hands rising, back straightening, the entire space snapping into alignment in a wave of silent recognition. Arthur Hayes did not rush. He did not react with surprise or pride. He simply lifted his hand, slow and steady, returning the salute with the same quiet precision, as if the gesture belonged to a time and place far beyond the present moment, as if it had been waiting, unchanged, all these years. And in that exchange, brief and wordless, the truth settled over the hangar with a weight no one could ignore, not loud, not forced, but absolute in its presence, leaving behind a silence that no longer questioned, no longer doubted, but understood. The salute did not end the moment. It deepened it, because what followed was not release, not relief, but a silence so complete it felt like the entire hangar had been reset, every assumption stripped away, every voice stilled under the weight of what had just been revealed, and in that silence, the smallest movements became impossible to ignore. Admiral Reeves lowered his hand slowly, not breaking eye contact with Arthur Hayes, and for a brief second there was no rank between them, no chain of command, no structure, only recognition, the kind that did not need explanation because it had been earned long before anyone else in that room had ever worn a uniform. Ryan Cole stood frozen, not by order, but by realization. The certainty that had carried him just minutes ago now replaced by something heavier, something far less comfortable. As his mind worked to reconcile the image in front of him with everything he believed he understood about authority, about respect, about who belonged and who did not. Around him, the others remained locked in place. Their salutes held a fraction longer than necessary, not out of protocol, but out of instinct, as if lowering their hands too quickly would somehow break the gravity of the moment. Lieutenant Ellis felt it most clearly, the shift from tension to understanding, the quiet click of realization settling into place as the pieces he had sensed earlier finally aligned, and he straightened fully now, not reacting, but acknowledging, his gaze no longer searching, no longer questioning. Admiral Reeves took one final step forward, closing the last of the distance between himself and Arthur, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but unmistakably personal in a way that carried far beyond volume. "You kept it," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the hat, then back to Arthur's face. And though the words were simple, they carried the weight of years that no one else present could measure. Arthur gave the slightest nod, not proud, not defensive, just certain. It was never mine to lose. The exchange was quiet, almost private, yet it echoed through the room with more force than any command ever could, because it confirmed what the salute had already revealed, that this was not a misunderstanding, not an error in protocol, but something far older, far deeper than any system currently in place. Ryan's jaw tightened, his posture still rigid, but no longer anchored in control, as the realization settled fully now, undeniable and complete, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not know what to say. The confidence that had driven his words earlier now felt distant, out of place, replaced by a silence that demanded something else, something he had not prepared for. Admiral Reeves turned then, not abruptly, not sharply, but with the same measured control that had defined every movement he had made since entering the hangar, and his gaze landed on Ryan, steady and direct, not angry, not raised, but carrying a weight that required no volume to be understood. "Return it," he said, and the instruction was simple, precise, leaving no room for interpretation, no space for hesitation. Ryan moved immediately, the response automatic, his hand lifting with a precision that mirrored the discipline he had always relied on. But this time the motion carried something different, not authority, not enforcement, but correction, as he reached forward and carefully adjusted the hat back into its place, his fingers lingering for the briefest second before withdrawing, as if acknowledging that what he had touched was not his to question. He stepped back then, a half pace, subtle but unmistakable, and lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the shift quiet, internal, but visible to those who understood what they were seeing. Arthur did not react to the gesture, did not acknowledge it outwardly, because he did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy with tension, but with clarity, the kind that settled slowly, firmly, leaving no doubt in its wake. Around them, the hangar remained still, every man present now fully aware that they had witnessed something that would not be recorded in reports, would not appear in files, but would be remembered nonetheless, carried forward not as information, but as understanding. And in that stillness, the balance had shifted completely, not through force, not through argument, but through something far more enduring, something that did not need to prove itself because it had already been lived. No one moved to speak after the command had been carried out, and that absence of noise did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, as if the entire hangar had agreed, without words, that anything said now would only diminish what had already been made clear, and in that quiet, the smallest details began to surface, the subtle shifts in posture, the way hands returned to sides a fraction slower than usual, the way eyes lingered just a moment longer on Arthur Hayes before looking away, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect that had not been there before. Admiral Reeves remained where he stood, his presence still anchoring the space, but the intensity had changed, no longer sharp, no longer immediate, settling instead into something steadier, something that did not need to assert itself because it had already been understood. He glanced once more at the hat, at the worn fabric and the nearly erased insignia, and there was a quiet weight in that look, something reflective, something that reached beyond the present moment into a time that only he and Arthur seemed to share. "They told me it was gone," the Admiral said finally, his voice low, measured, carrying easily through the stillness without needing to rise. And though the words were simple, they drew the attention of everyone in the room once more, not sharply, not abruptly, but completely. Arthur's gaze remained steady, his expression unchanged, but there was something in the way he listened now, something that suggested the words mattered, even if he did not show it outwardly. "Most things like that are," Arthur replied, his tone calm, almost reflective, "if no one remembers where they were left." The exchange was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried a depth that extended far beyond the surface of the words, and for those listening, it felt like hearing a language they only partially understood, something rooted in experience rather than explanation. Ryan Cole stood where he had stepped back, his posture no longer rigid in assertion, but held in place by something else, something closer to awareness, and as he watched the two men speak, he realized that whatever connection existed between them was not something that could be found in any file, any record, any briefing he had ever studied, and that realization settled heavily, not as a blow, but as a correction. Lieutenant Ellis shifted slightly, his attention still fixed, but no longer searching, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet clarity that made everything feel sharper, more defined, as if the moment had moved from uncertainty into understanding without ever needing to explain itself. Around them, the others remained still, but the energy had changed, no longer charged with anticipation, but grounded, steady, the kind of silence that follows after something important has already happened. Admiral Reeves exhaled slowly, the motion subtle, almost imperceptible, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a different weight, not authority this time, but acknowledgement. "There are not many left who would recognize it," he said, his eyes briefly scanning the room, not judging, not measuring, but simply observing, and then returning to Arthur, where they settled with quiet certainty. "That was never the point," Arthur replied, and the words came without hesitation, without emphasis, as if they had been settled long ago and required no further discussion. The Admiral gave the slightest nod, not formal, not ceremonial, but personal, and for a moment the two men stood in that shared understanding, the years between them compressed into something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Then, as naturally as it had begun, the moment began to release its hold on the room, not abruptly, not sharply, but gradually, like tension easing from a line that had been pulled tight for too long. A tool clinked softly somewhere in the distance. A radio crackled faintly, and the ambient sounds of the base began to return, hesitant at first, then steady, filling the space once more. Ryan shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but meaningful, as if grounding himself again in the present, and though he did not speak, the change in him was clear, not in what he said, but in what he no longer needed to say. Arthur adjusted the brim of his hat just slightly, a simple, familiar motion, and for the first time since the moment had begun, he looked away from the Admiral, his gaze drifting across the hangar, taking in the space, the people, the silence that had now transformed into something quieter, something settled. And in that quiet, it was clear to everyone present that what had happened would not be repeated, not because it could not be, but because it did not need to be. The lesson already written, already understood, carried forward not in orders or reports, but in the memory of a single moment where everything had shifted without a single word being raised. The moment did not end with a command. It ended with movement so quiet it almost went unnoticed, as Admiral Reeves took a small step back, not in retreat, not in dismissal, but in completion, the kind that marked the closing of something that had already fulfilled its purpose. And in that single step the center of gravity in the hangar shifted once more, not back to what it had been, but forward into something new, something settled. Arthur Hayes gave the faintest nod, not formal, not ceremonial, but sufficient, and then he turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm precision that had defined every action he had taken since the moment began, his boots making a soft, measured sound against the concrete as he began to walk toward the far side of the hangar. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The path in front of him opened naturally, men stepping aside without instruction, without hesitation, as if guided by an understanding that did not need to be voiced. Ryan Cole watched him go, his eyes following the slow, steady movement. And for the first time since he had spoken that first line, there was no impulse to interrupt, no need to assert. Only the quiet realization that the moment had already passed beyond anything he could change. The hat remained where it belonged, untouched now, no longer an object of question, but a symbol that did not require explanation. And as Arthur moved further away, the worn fabric caught the light for a brief second, revealing just enough of the faded insignia to remind those who had seen it that some things were not meant to be fully understood, only recognized. Admiral Reeves remained still for a moment longer, his gaze following Arthur's path until the distance between them grew enough that the present could reclaim its place. And then he turned back to the room, his expression composed once more, the personal moment set aside with the same discipline that had brought him there in the first place. His eyes moved briefly to Ryan, not harsh, not lingering, but clear, carrying a message that did not need words, and Ryan met that look for a second before lowering his gaze, not out of shame, but out of acknowledgement, the kind that settled deeper than any spoken correction. Around them, the hangar began to breathe again, the quiet hum returning, footsteps resuming, voices low and measured, as if the space itself had learned something it would not forget. Lieutenant Ellis exhaled slowly, the tension finally releasing from his shoulders as he clipped his device back into place, his mind already recording the moment in a way no official report ever would, not as data, but as understanding. Arthur reached the edge of the hangar without looking back, his pace unchanged, his presence steady, and as he stepped into the light beyond, he seemed to carry the silence with him, leaving behind not an absence, but a clarity that settled over everyone who remained. Ryan shifted his stance one last time, grounding himself in the familiar structure of the world he knew. But that structure felt different now, not broken, not weakened, but expanded, as if something had been added that could not be removed. Admiral Reeves gave a final glance toward the open space where Arthur had disappeared, then turned fully, his voice returning at last, calm, controlled, and unmistakably official. "Resume," he said, and the single word was enough, not to erase what had happened, but to carry it forward into everything that followed. The hangar moved again, but it did not return to what it had been, because something had shifted, something quiet and permanent, and though no one would write it down, no one would record it in any system or file, it would remain, carried in the way they stood, the way they spoke, the way they chose silence when it mattered most. And as the day continued, as orders were given and tasks completed, one truth lingered beneath it all, steady and unspoken, like the echo of a salute that never really fades, because some respect is not commanded, and it is not displayed, it is remembered, long after the moment itself has passed.